Deep in the heart of a great forest, almost 200 years ago, lived a woodcutter with his wife and 3 sons. The 2 eldest sons were big and strong, and they too were woodcutters. The youngest son, Tom, was weak and almost too small to hold an axe, and while his father and 2 elder brothers cut down the trees from morning until night, Tom remained at home. One cold winter's morning, the woodcutter fell ill, and he was unable to go into the woods to cut trees. The eldest son, seeing how ill his father was, offered to work twice as hard, so that they would have enough wood to sell. The woodcutter's wife baked a potato pie for the eldest son to take with him, and off he went into the forest with a pie in one hand and a huge axe in the other. The eldest son sat down on a log and ate half the potato pie, and then he began to chop down a tree. After a long morning's work, the eldest son grew hungry again, and he sat down to eat the remaining half of the pie. Just as he opened his mouth to bite from the pie, a little man popped out from behind a gnarled old oak tree and begged the eldest son for a piece of potato pie. "Be off with you," said the eldest son angrily. "If I share my pie with you, I shall not have enough for myself." The little man looked very sad and hurried off into the forest. The eldest son finished the potato pie without giving the little man another thought, and he picked up his axe and began to cut down another tree. But at the first stroke of the axe, the eldest son slipped, and the sharp blade glanced off the tree and bit into his leg, causing a bad wound. The eldest son limped home to have his leg bound. The woodcutter was no better on the second day, and his eldest son lay in bed with a bandaged leg. The second eldest son, seeing the plight of his father and brother, offered to do 3 times the amount of work, and his mother baked a big meat pie for him to take into the forest. Off went the second son with the meat pie in one hand and a huge axe in the other. Before cutting down the tree, the second son took out the meat pie and settled down to eat a portion of it before commencing woodcutting. Just as he was about to take a bite, the little man popped out from behind the gnarled old oak tree and said, "Please share your pie with me, for I'm so hungry." "Ah!" exclaimed the second son, staring down angrily at the little man. "Share my pie with you? I should think not. I'm a woodcutter, and I need every last crumb of this pie before I begin to cut the trees. Now away with you." Tears formed in the little man's eye, and he hurried away into the woods. Placing the remainder of the pie in his smock, the second son picked up the axe and swung it at the tall elm tree. No sooner had the blade struck the bark of the tree than it glanced off and cut the second son's leg. Tearing off a piece from the bottom of his smock, the second son bound the wound and limped off home. On the third day, Tom, the weakest of the woodcutter's 3 sons, was troubled by the plight of his father and 2 brothers and offered to cut trees in the forest. "I know I'm only small, father, but perhaps the few twigs I could cut with a small axe would fetch a few coins to buy food with," said Tom eagerly. "Ha ha ha!" roared the woodcutter. "I don't think you could carry an axe, Tom, let alone cut a tree with it," laughed his father. Nevertheless, Tom pleaded with his father to allow him to work in the woods, and at last the woodcutter agreed. But there was no pie for poor Tom, just a crust of bread and a leather flask of water. He was also given the oldest, rustiest axe to take into the forest. Tom wandered off into the forest and sat down on a log to eat his crust of bread before starting the day's work. No sooner had he popped the first piece of bread into his mouth than the little man appeared from behind the gnarled old oak tree. "Please let me have a bite to eat," asked the little man in a sad voice. "Why, of course," said Tom, who, unlike his elder brothers, was a kindly, thoughtful lad. "I have only a crust of stale bread and a flask of water, but I'll gladly share it with you." The little man sprung onto the log on which Tom was sitting and touched the bread with his long fingers. Suddenly, the bread vanished, and in its place sat a beautiful brown pie. The little man then touched the water flask in the same manner, and instantly became a jug of burgundy wine. Tom looked in absolute wonder at what had taken place, and the little man looked up at him with a merry twinkle in his eye and chuckled. "There," said the little man, "now we can both eat and drink, and I shall repay you for your kindness." The pie eaten, and the wine jug lying empty, The little man led Tom to the gnarled old oak tree. "You must cut down this old tree," he said to Tom, "and there, beneath its ancient roots, you'll find a token of my thanks." The little man then ran off into the forest, leaving Tom feeling slightly bewildered. Tom did as the little man had suggested, and with magical strength cut down the old oak tree. And to his amazement, there, amid the tangled cluster of roots, sat a goose. It was no ordinary goose, however, for its feathers were of pure gold, and they shone brightly in the sunlight. "I shall take the goose to the market, and I'll sell it," he muttered to himself. Before Tom could journey home through the forest, night fell, and he stopped at a small inn. Putting the goose in the stable for the night, Tom crept around to the back door of the inn, and spent the night on a heap of flour sacks in the kitchen. Next day, bright and early, Tom crept quietly out of the kitchen and walked round to the barn to collect the goose. As he was about to enter the barn, Tom spied the landlord's daughter plucking a feather from the goose's tail.
"What a beautiful golden goose,"
she said.
"I must have a feather to wear in my hat."
Once the landlord's daughter had touched the goose's tail, she found that her hand was stuck fast. No matter what she did, the girl could not free her hand, and she began to cry. Hearing the weeping, the girl's sister came running into the barn, but when she saw the golden goose, she too reached out to pluck a feather from its tail. She also became stuck, and after a few minutes, in came the landlord himself to see what all the fuss was about. Being a greedy man, the landlord wanted a feather from the golden goose's tail, but no sooner had he reached out to push his two daughters aside than he became stuck. By this time, Tom had become rather impatient, and, wishing to get to the market early, he took the golden goose and tucked it under his arm. But there, still stuck fast to its tail, were the landlord and his two daughters. Off they tramped through the lanes and across the fields until a parson spied them. "Stop!" he cried. "How dare you chase that poor young man?" The parson reached out for the landlord's coat, and, would you believe it, he became stuck fast. So it went on until Tom, with the goose still tucked under his arm, led the landlord, two daughters, a parson, a postman, a coachman, a milkmaid, and a spinster across the fields and down the dales. Tom's path to the market took him past the king's palace, and in the garden stood a young princess who had never been known to smile. For many, many years the king had tried to bring a smile to the face of the princess, but he could not succeed. However, the minute the princess set eyes on Tom and his goose, with a landlord, two daughters, a parson, a postman, a coachman, and a milkmaid, and a spinster, all stuck fast to each other, she began to laugh and laugh and laugh. The king, seeing his daughter so happy, ran out of the palace and after Tom. "Young man," he called, "come back here this instant." Tom, upon hearing such a noble voice, stopped, and so did the landlord, two daughters, a parson, a postman, a coachman, a milkmaid, and a spinster, and they all fell in a great tangle on the ground. Seeing this, the princess laughed even more, and Tom, turning round and casting his eyes on her for the first time, fell in love. The princess looked at Tom's jolly face, and she too fell in love. And at that moment, the magic that held everyone together disappeared, and their hands became free. The king looked at Tom and said, "You have made my daughter so happy that I shall give you permission to marry her within the week." Tom and the princess were married, and they went to live in the king's fine palace. And the golden goose was placed in a marble pond, where it swam happily amid the water lilies and duckweeds. The little man in the forest had truly repaid Tom's kindness.